Hey everybody, April Fools. So here I am. I'm introducing this John Fahey interview series. There's two parts. We only intended it as one part, but after talking for close to an hour, I realized, you know, let's make a second part. So here I am with Steve Lowenthal, the biographer of the John Fahey um, book, The Life of John Fahey, which is still available. I'll link to where you can buy it below. Lowenthal is part of the Vindu Select Qualité label, or that's his label. He curates that label. He's had everyone in there from Mark McGuire, Thurston Moore, Glenn Jones, Chuck Johnson, Michael Chapman, Bill Orcutt, all solo guitar records. So obviously solo guitar is a big part of what he likes, and obviously a natural one to write this book. And also joining me is Sean Cole's Train. Doesn't do videos, but as you know, he's a good friend of mine. He was on our live streams we do him, and he's in the band Birth Defects, which is about to release their final record and tours. I'll link to that. But yeah, here's part one. We go through the life up through the 60s, and then part two, we do the 70s and beyond. So hope you enjoy this. Steve Lowenthal and this panel discussion about John Fahey.
This young man has taken the blues and made it a semi-classical form of music. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present John Fahey.
Gee, I didn't know I did all right. G, P, yeah, okay. Well, here's when the springtime comes again, mostly.
Dom seeking a thread. I'm here with Sean. Sean's or Cole's Train. You're sort of
Yeah, whatever. It's what
how do you classify
it's
your
I just use the Coles train thing is because that Gmail I like despise Google and Gmail,
yeah.
so that's like my junk account. So I
Oh, so
just
this is
what's
your
the most
junk channel.
obnoxious Coles train is the most obnoxious name, but yeah, I'm Sean.
Sean is in the excellent band Birth Defects, so I guess you're doing your
That
final tour, your victory route or your victory
our
lap is coming up.
our one and final tour after 7 years. So
Yep, that's coming up. We'll link to that to Birth Defects. And I'm here with Steve Lowenthal, where we're here talking about John Fahey today. So he wrote this excellent book, which is not in print, I believe, currently.
It's still in print. You can get it on Amazon. The
You
paperback
can.
is still, yeah.
Okay, okay. So Steve wrote this excellent The Life of John Fahey. And we're going to talk about Fahey, talk about this book, talk about his records, talk about his life. We're just going to get into it. So I guess first off, what was your introduction to John Fahey?
Oh, geez. In the 90s, I was, I grew up in New York, And Sonic Youth was like my favorite band, early 90s. So I would pretty much buy most of what was like recommended by Thurston and crew, and I had a subscription to the Sonic Death fanzine where he would do record reviews and whatnot, and it introduced me to pretty much everything from like krautrock to Fahey to Bikini Kill and Harry Pussy and all kinds of crazy underground music. I grew up in Westchester, about 40 minutes north of Manhattan, in the suburbs there, and
Okay.
it really, the music of John Fahey really connected with me, uh, pretty much instantaneously, and I wasn't really sure why at the time. I didn't really know much about it. Uh, Originally, it sounded to me like country music, because it was just
Hmm.
acoustic finger picking guitar stuff. But with the lack of any lyrics or whatnot, it just had this sort of existential kind of, thread to it, which sort of allowed me as a listener to sort of, put my own narrative on top of it. And, I would just, drive around New York and the suburbs listening to this John Fahey stuff. And it really, something about the ennui of it really connected with my sort of end of teenage, pre-college sort of transition into adulthood. And yeah, it just really like hit me sort of, it just, in this part of me that I didn't really know how to articulate and whatnot. And
Right.
musically, I didn't really have any precedent for it either. Again, I was, I was like a indie rock, punk rock, hardcore kind of kid in the 90s in New York. So I had absolutely no context for any kind of country or bluegrass music at all. I have no history of listening to anything like that. My parents never listened to anything like that at all. So I had zero context for the roots of what John Fahey was really extrapolating. So in some ways, it was actually like really new to me. And across the board. And I was somewhat mystified by it. And the more I began pulling the thread and learning about John Fahey, the more interested I became. Now, also, I just want to add this because I think this has
Hmm.
a lot of bearing to the topic at hand. Uh, Around the same time, so the first thing I got was the Legend of Blind Joe Death CD, which was the first Fahey recordings. So they're really like Fahey in his embryonic state at the beginning. And the other thing that I got exposed to Fahey wise concurrently, there's this amazing print zine in the late 90s called Halana, which I believe is a Baltimore publication. I could be wrong, but I think it was from Baltimore. And they published a written excerpt that Fahey wrote about his it's a semi-fictional story that Fahey wrote about going on a fishing trip with Booker White. And during this fishing trip, they're drinking, they're wrangling with this giant garfish, I think they refer to it as, this sort of like mythical sea creature that they're sort of like battling with. It almost has this like Loch Ness monster sort of proportions in the story. And as John is telling the story of him and Booker fishing and like battling for hours, this fish I guess he goes in within the story. He goes in this sort of like psychological trance, and he begins recalling past instances of childhood sexual abuse.
Right.
Was definitely a big part of his personal narrative in the 90s. And just reading this and this zine was just really, it really affected me about how open and sort of honest he was about these experiences. And it's just the writing was so different from anything else I had encountered at that time. And still to this day, I don't think I've come across another fiction or semi-fictional writer like John Fahey. The way he uses the written word and the way he tells a story is unlike anything I've read. And again, it was a very powerful impact, reading this article that John wrote in Halana. And again, so much of the 90s, a lot of entertainment figures, even in underground music, were maybe a little sarcastic, maybe guarded, maybe more flippant. There's sort of like kind of the end of the slacker aesthetic was sort of playing itself out. So yeah, nothing. There was no real narrative coming from a place of sincerity and coming from a place of vulnerability, like the way that John was exposing in his writing. And also, those same qualities come through in his music as well. And I think both of those, in both mediums, his honesty and his vulnerability and his ennui and his, existential sort of depth all really come through.
It's interesting, like, you're discovering his music, which you have no context for. And by the way, what you described is almost the exact narrative to how I discovered him. I think I bought the same CD initially. I discovered it through like Thurston Moore, Sonic Youth, and and to get all that music with no context for it, and then get all these these writings that he did, which are always based on some level of truth and maybe a whole lot more fiction. It's it's a lot to absorb all at once. Did you start working backwards and start picking up records from then, or discovering the releases themselves, or where did you go from there? Did you go all in on him, or was that later?
Yeah, I mean, I just started getting deeper and deeper into, underground music culture in general, record collecting, just, all the sort of like foundations of what my adult life would become, where, the seeds were really planted, in the late 90s and whatnot. So, and, Fahey was, certainly at that time having a moment. He was very relevant in underground music circles. He was working with Jim O'Rourke and No Neck Blues Band and people like that. He was touring nationally at the time, so there was always these shows going on with all these different people. He had his own label, Revenant, at the
Yeah.
time, which was putting out really really cool stuff, both historical documents and sort of contemporary things. So, yeah, I mean, in some ways, John Fahey was sort of like my introduction to 20th century folk music in a large way. And then, through him, Revenant released, the fourth volume of the Harry Smith anthology, uh,
Yes.
which was, such a huge piece, I mean, of American culture. And, that's where Dylan comes from. That's where, so much of what happened in the 60s comes from and whatnot. So, John was acting much as he was to me in the 90s, sort of unwittingly, in a similar sense that he was to the folkies in the 60s when he was out in Berkeley, because he was the guy that really knew his stuff out there. And
He was like, I mean, he was so ahead of his time in so many ways, having an independent label, talking
Yeah, I was
about,
just gonna say he's the like to me he's and if this is a narrative that if you watch the documentary, and I think even in your book, Steve, you kind of allude to this or maybe flat out say it. He was pretty punk. I think
yeah,
real quickly, I got into Fahey kind of the same way you both did. But there was this gentleman in Baltimore that used to run a record store, and I still keep in touch with him every so often. His name is Ian Nagalski, and
I'm friends with Ian. Yeah.
yeah, Ian's great. He'd actually, when I sold my record collection many, many years ago to fund my record label, he was the guy that he came by and he knew what I had, and he was like, "I'm gonna buy your whole collection, lock, stock, and barrel." But anyways, I went to his record store in Baltimore, and I was kind of into, I was definitely into like Hino at the KG Hino and stuff like this. I was really getting into like abstract guitar work. And I remember I was at the store and we were just hanging out and I think we were even talking about like even just Unwound or something. He was telling me a story about how he saw them in the 90s. And then I think a Fahey record, he had it in a pile and he put it on. And I was like, and I'd heard the name through Thurston and I was, kind of really into O'Rourke at the time, still am. And he just kind of schooled me. He was like, all right, here's this. Just get this record. Like I just bought it directly from him after he played it. But I ended up getting into the 90s stuff first.
Yeah.
And
that's
I worked
interesting.
my
Yeah,
way backwards. I knew that that wasn't what Fahey actually was like. You know what I mean? I
yeah,
knew that that was just the last tale of his career, but it was so interesting to work my way backwards. And then literally the last thing I heard was his first record. That was
right,
like I actually kind of I didn't mean to do it in that way, but
yeah.
it worked that way and it was super eye-opening. So anyways, for me it's I think going back to what I was kind of originally saying was that he was like the first punk. It was like it was kind of like when you first read about Sun Ra and how Sun Ra started Saturn, and it's like, oh wow, this was happening then. You know what I mean? Like it just contextually, it's like to me because I'm in my early 40s, you know, DIY culture kind of starts with, you know, like hardcore, like early
Yeah.
80s hardcore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I know it doesn't, but that's just my frame of reference. So, anyways, but yeah, I know the narrative is that Fahey was pretty punk, and what you were kind of getting at, Dom, and I think Steve, you kind of said it's just he operated in such a different way to even his peers, or even the
Yeah.
people that were almost as weird as he was. You know, there was
Well, I mean, right. And you talk about how he seemingly was wanted to be a part of like the hippie movement, or he wanted to be associated with some of these ideas, but at the same time, he was completely going against it. He was doing everything and fighting against like his own sort of peers. He saw himself almost as like an older, an older soul, but at the same time, he was trying to sort of like appeal to some of these people, like when he moved out to Berkeley, I guess, and it's just so interesting to have him like create a label. He's going out with Joe Bussard and buying and reselling 78s. Like he's doing all kinds of things that nowadays people are like, John Fahey was doing this in the early 60s.
Well, he was doing it in the late 50s.
Right,
And
right.
also, he was 17 years old when he self-released his first record, which was almost unimaginable even to this day.
Which
Uh,
is not this version, but
not that version, but close to it.
I wish.
So another thing, just getting back to Fahey, sort of his inspiration in regards to independently self-releasing music, in a crazy series of events, one of his high school friends was this guy named Anthony Lee, and Anthony's aunt used to date Harry Parch, which is bizarre because Harry Parch is such a sort of marginal figure in the greater sense of the music world. So I mean, he's a pretty obscure guy then. And another reason, which is kind of odd, that Anthony Lee's wife dated Harry Parch was because he was very much a gay man. So I guess she dated him prior to his sexual.
Right.
That being said, Anthony Lee and Fahey used to listen to Harry Parch records in high school because his aunt had actual copies of the self-released Gate 5 Harry Parch stuff.
Mm.
They would play this music over the school PA system as like a prank because they thought, because this is like such bizarre, wacky music. So their sense of humor is a prank. Let's play this over the school PA. But the fact of the matter was that even in 1957, 58, when Fahey was just starting to begin musically as a teenager, he did have this example of Harry Parch, the Gate 5 label and records being self-released. So he like physically was able to touch these records, which are so obscure that it really is sort of a miracle that they found its way to somebody who was inspired to them to that degree.
well, Steve, you saying that real quick, then what that means, I didn't know that, but what that means is there's a through line between Fahey and the Stooges.
Yeah.
Because they are the psychedelic Stooges. Like Iggy has gone on record and was like, one of my biggest influences was Harry Parch. We would turn off the
You like that
lights
percussion,
and
yeah.
just listen to Harry Parch records, and that's what the psychedelic Stooges wanted to sound like. So, just an aside, you can kind of make that through line with Fahey and the Stooges. So, yeah, I think that's pretty cool.
I mean, who's to say whether or not Fahey would have, had the gumption to do what he did without that particular inspiration? But, even outside of the, him self-releasing his own stuff and starting Tacoma in the 50s, him and Joe Bussard, who you mentioned earlier, Joe was cutting his own, lathe cut 78s on his Phonotone label, and Fahey was very much involved, with that and being a participant in in that endeavor and being like a musical source for a lot of those things. And, for Fahey, it was really a way to play out his obsessions with the blues. And again, like it's very mysterious stuff, the blues. These stories were not documented. Most of these records weren't documented. There weren't, compilations,
Right.
collecting this material. This stuff was really forgotten, through time. by the late 1950s.
Or yeah,
The country blues stuff, I mean, nobody was at all interested in it, and
that's just prior to the real folk like revival, essentially, just a few years. He's ahead of that.
he's very much ahead of that. And, him and Joe Bussard and Dick Spotswood and his whole, crew of young people in the, DC area, because they were like physically right on the border of the South, they literally took it upon themselves to drive into, black neighborhoods and literally go door to door, knocking on people's doors, asking if they had any old records.
Hmm.
I mean,
And
like
it,
that was, I
Yeah,
mean,
think about that. Yeah.
it's crazy, and it was also a very dangerous endeavor for a bunch of white teenagers to be going, crossing these color and cultural boundaries, going into these neighborhoods which they weren't, culturally allowed to be in, and really,
Steve, could you expand on the story? And I'm curious because what you're kind of getting at. There was I know that I think this was in the documentary or maybe even in the book. They were doing that one day, and I think the story goes that he went to somebody's house and asked for, "Hey, do you have any records?" And he ended up finding a Charlie Patton like 78, and he immediately knew what it was and didn't want to say anything. So he just kind of acted as if like, oh, let me just take all these and get out of here. And
yep.
but that was supposedly that was like one of the most important records that he found while doing that. This almost sort of research, right? Like this is almost like research for him.
Very much so. And also, I mean, like to them, I mean, Patton was a huge figure. And I think the most elusive and the most sort of like, holy grail for them was Skip James. Skip James was really the guy that they were absolutely mystified by, generally because of his guitar tunings. Skip James played, and again, I'm not a guitar player, I'm not a musician, so don't kill me if I get this wrong. But I believe James played in a drop D tuning, which was very, very unusual at the time.
Hmm.
Again, that was sort of picked up more by metal bands and stuff in the '90s as like as a technique. But so I think Fahey and his cohorts heard Skip James and they're like, "Whoa, this guy's like the heaviest of the heavy country blues guys." He had like kind of like a "Devil Got My Woman" had sort of like an evil kind of aura to it, and a lot of it comes from these tunings. And I know that a huge part in John's discovery of Skip James, not only his music but him as a musician, as a person. They actually found him, in a hospital in the South, and sort of
That's in the book here. The story about him meeting Skip James is amazing. Like, yeah, talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
no, not at all. So yeah, again, John and his friends, they were some of the first record collectors. And again, it's sort of like collecting records really wasn't a thing uh, in the 1940s and the 1950s. They're seen as disposable. It wasn't really seen as like an art. The records didn't, have resale value at the time. Like, people just, didn't really think too much about them, more or less. So, John and his friends, since there was no way to hear this material, again, there was no compilations, radio stations weren't playing this stuff, there was no internet, there was no live circuit that the country blues guys were playing in, up in DC or anything like that. They would play in, more like house shows or small bars and, in their local communities and whatnot. So really the only way to experience this music was to find these records somehow, these impossible rare records. And, again, we discussed a little bit about their process for doing so. And then, they got really into the idea of, wow, some of these people are still around and we could find these people and actually get the real story direct from the source. And not only the story of the songs, but again, from a musician's standpoint, how they made them, what the guitars they used, how they tuned them, how they played them, how they, fingered their chords and whatnot. So yeah, so they would write to post offices in towns where maybe the singer or someone in these old 78s would mention a town or mention a neighborhood, and then they would go to the post office in those towns and write them looking for those people or any relatives or anyone who knew any of those people. And eventually, through this process, they found out that Skip James was alive, and he was sick and in a hospital somewhere. I believe it was Mississippi. Again, I apologize. It's been 11 years since I wrote the book, so
Right.
it's
This
been a
book was
while.
published a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, the book was published 11 years ago, so I haven't looked at my notes in a long time. So again, I apologize if any of my specifics are slightly off, but I do believe, if my own memory is correct, that they did find Skip James in a hospital in Mississippi, and they paid his bills to get him out. I believe he owed money for his procedures and
And
whatnot.
the story was too, he was rather a scary individual, or they were a little terrified of him.
Well, from their accounts, he was a very surly man.
Yeah.
Uh, he was, he lived a tough life. Skip James was the son of a preacher. He, dabbled with, um, with God, I'm trying to think of with bootlegging liquor. During Prohibition, he was involved in crime, during that time, and he was definitely one of those people. A lot of the blues deals with sort of spirituality versus everyday life, and just sort of like how to live one's life, in a secular and a spiritual sense, and sort of the dichotomy between those two worlds. And Skip James was definitely had one foot planted in both of those worlds and definitely wrestled with the dichotomy between them. So yeah, he's a guy that had a lot of demons. And again, it's hard. We're just dealing with historical accounts through third parties, but apparently he was a pretty surly guy. He wasn't particularly friendly.
Right.
I think John expected a warm reception from Skip James. He expected gratitude. He expected, thanks for the interest in his work. And Skip James didn't give them
He
any.
wasn't having any. Yeah.
He wasn't interested in these white boys. He wasn't interested in their guitar playing. He wasn't interested in their stories or their fandom or whatnot. He was just focused on whatever he was focused on.
How did that affect Fahey afterwards? Because I know they kind of the story goes, I think that they left the hospital. Did they offer him a record? This was before Fahey was had a label, right? Or was this
Yeah. Right.
this is like right before, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Fahey, Tacoma was just sort of his vanity imprint, let's say, when
So
it
it did
started.
exist at that particular
It
point.
did
Okay.
exist, and I think Tacoma as a record label, as we see it, really started in the '60s, when Fahey partnered up with Ed Denson, who was the manager of Country Joe and the Fish, who was business oriented guy who was really like responsible about getting the records out and presenting them in the way. He was the guy that hired Tom Weller to do all the psychedelic art, for all the mono editions and whatnot. So Ed Denson was the guy that really made yes, yeah, Tom Weller artwork, some of the best. And that was
Beautiful. Yeah.
that was Ed Denson's choice. That was not John Fahey's choice. John Fahey was not interested in psychedelia at all.
Right.
Um, and whereas Ed Denson was very much part of that movement, especially being with the whole Country Joe and the Fish crew, who we have to, going back at that time in like 1967, like they were like $1 million
Yeah.
platinum rock band. They were like a big deal, whereas John Fahey was still this like sort of obscure, genre kind of like cultish, sort of figurehead. And getting back to what you're saying about John's interactions in the '60s with the hippie and psychedelic movements, um, he really rejected all of that, across the board. He rejected the music. He wasn't interested in the music. He wasn't interested in the drug use or the psychedelics. He wasn't interested in iconography and the radical artwork of the time and whatnot. He was way more of a traditionalist in that regard. Um, he was interested in guitar playing. He was interested in his career. He did want to be successful. He did want to reach a bigger audience. He was very excited when he signed to Vanguard. Um, but he was never willing to do what it took to become popular, which was sort of play the game. He wasn't there to make friends. He wasn't there to sort of hang out and party and be a cool guy. He was the record guy.
But he
Uh,
was like also friends with like Al Wilson,
and
from
yeah,
Canned Heat, and so he was like he was sort of he was on the fringes of all that and rejecting it, but still, as you said, like trying to have a career out of this.
we have to understand, like Canned Heat again were also a very popular band. They played Woodstock. They were a party band. I
Yeah,
mean, and their singer, Bob the Bear, he was a very gregarious guy. He was the party guy. Everyone would go to his house to listen to records, and he was like, very well loved in the community. Al Wilson, on the other hand, was a brilliant guitar player and had huge personality deficits. Like he could not talk to people, he couldn't relate to people. He didn't shower. Apparently, he
mhm.
had a terrible odor and stench. Guys like, Al Wilson and Robbie Basho, they were in the 60s, in the scene, doing their thing, and they couldn't get girls,
Yeah,
which was
right.
like part of the whole zeitgeist of the free love 60s peace love movement. All that stuff was free love and all that sort of thing. And like Al Wilson like just smelled too bad and was too awkward for girls to talk to him. So that's who Fahey hung out with.
It's
He
just fascinating at the time for him to be, concurrently running alongside this, starting his own label, essentially creating his own genre and style. I mean, that didn't exist. I mean, he took taking the blues, taking, Harry Parcher, taking composers and effectively coming up with his own genre. That there's no other analog for what he was doing at that time.
No, he pretty much invented the doorway through which all other solo guitar players
Yeah.
passed subsequently.
And interesting too is like some of the early reviews, like this guy's not a very good guitar player. Like there's this idea that he's like not technically proficient, and there's a lot of like errors, and like that's part of why he wanted to re-record, I guess, the first album,
Very much
which
so.
is it's there's like an appreciation for him early on, but also like I don't know that this guy's totally trained or totally knows what he's doing.
And he didn't. I mean, when he was 17 years old, recording that first record and putting
Yeah.
it out, pressing up 100 copies and selling it at his local gas station, it took him 3 years just to run through those 100 copies. He was not thinking about posterity. He was not thinking about legacy. He was not thinking about genre. He was not thinking about his effect on the rest of the world. Like this was a totally insular pursuit that
And
he
just so everyone's clear, like this is the first technically first press. Well, it's not technically the first pressing. It's the most widely available pressing you can get, which is rare in itself. The first 100, it's a little bit different. Has the cover is a little more plain and the label's different. And those are the very first private pressings that he did, which are impossibly rare. And I've never seen one. So
I've seen one. Dr.
I
Demento, Barry
right,
Hansen, showed me his copy. But
yes.
Steve,
I
real quick, not to
yes,
interrupt you, but I was just thinking,
oh,
do you know with we're talking about the very first pressing of that record, and this is a nerdy question, but I was curious, do we know where that was pressed, how he even ended up like who how because I assume that pressing records at that particular point in time was hard for when Discord started, let's say, right? I
yes.
can't imagine what it would be like if when Fahey was trying to press records.
This is 1959, 1959, the original.
So
Um,
do we have any like information on how that kind of went about?
I don't have any like documentation about where he got it pressed and what that process was like for him. But I do know that at the time he was very much involved with his church. There's a church youth group that he was a part of, and that was like his social, like that was that's where he socialized, and that's where he hung out with his friends. Nancy McLean, who plays flute on a couple tracks on Voice of the Turtle and whatnot, she was in his church group and whatnot. And I believe that their pastor at this church group was a very like liberal kind of like pre-hippie kind of guy. And I'm just going out on a little bit of a limb here. There was definitely like private pressings of church sermons and gospel stuff at that time. So I kind of have a feeling that Fahey got sort of like, guided by this by his pastor in his youth group that he was very, very, very much involved with. And that
Right.
would be my guess about how he got his that first record pressed.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to derail it, but I that's a piece of information that I'm just very curious about because just quickly going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, what he was doing again, and I'm gonna probably use this term a lot, but it really was punk. And as you're speaking and talking about it, the narrative it almost reflects. I'm just using Discord as an example, but like it's sort of like the it's like, well, I'm just gonna do this thing myself, and we've all heard that narrative before. And but it's just interesting to hear that from an artist from the 50s. You know what I mean? It's such a contextually it's you're right. There was,
Yeah.
and like you were saying, Dom, there was really nobody like this at the time. At least I can't think of, you know.
No.
So it's very fascinating that he was even able to do 100 copies of a record, lay everything out, get it mastered, even if it
Yep.
was crudely mastered. Like it's just very interesting.
I mean, it's, I mean, I love punk rock and Discord, and I grew up with all that stuff too. But I'd say the biggest difference between Fahey and punk rock, yes, they're both sort of independent-minded pursuits. But punk rock, in my opinion, was really like a community-based event. Like here's all these people, we're getting together, we're going to do this together, we're going to pool our resources
Right.
and rent this thing, we're going to do this together, and this is our community and this is our group. Fahey was just by himself. I mean, he was
Right.
Yeah.
really alone. There wasn't like a scene of other guitar players doing what he was doing. His friends weren't really interested in it. And he, you know, I don't know really what his ambitions were at that time, other than just sort of like indulging his interests and fantasies and then like exploring the blues through this process.
And he's really going backwards. Punk was looking forward to a new thing. Essentially, he's like, I'm living back here, essentially, but and inventing a style and doing his own thing. But yeah,
Well, that was the fascinating thing to me about Fahey, or one of the fascinating things about Fahey, was he wasn't really doing the blues. It wasn't, he wasn't doing Skip James. He wasn't doing country blues. He took part of that and fused it with, what he was listening to with country and bluegrass and whatnot, and sort of channeling it through this sort of like suburban ennui. And that was, again, going back to like my first relations with Fahey upon first hearing it. And I think what connected me with it was, to me, it always was the music of the suburbs.
Mm.
And that's really where John Fahey came from, and that was the first generation of the suburbs. So there wasn't really like a commodified teen angst yet. Rock and roll and sort of, everything that came after, which was really like sort of, this youth rebellion explosion, hadn't happened. So there wasn't really any language to talk about his feelings of being isolated as a teenager, feeling like he was an outcast in his town, of not having a place where he feels he fits in the world. The blues the country blues and stuff dealt with very distinct hardships. Dealt with racism, class issues, money, fidelity, all of these sort of like very human sort of like everyday struggles of the people who were, the musicians at the time. Whereas his struggles and sort of his, what he was talking about was really abstract, and there wasn't really a language for it yet. And he was really sort of inventing that sort of, wordlessly. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of that is communicated more so through his liner notes, and whatnot. And when you combine the liner notes with the music and you sit around and you listen to the record while reading the notes, it really starts to come together as a different thing. Because whereas the country blues might explain in a literal sense what it's about in the lyrics, there were no lyrics to John's work. So it was, like I said, it was existential, and it was sort of, there wasn't a linear narrative to what he was doing. So he was trying to explain that in his writing to a certain degree, but his writing was also sort of abstract as well. So there wasn't really, it was really hard to sort of put a pin on exactly what he was trying to express. But definitely the feelings and sort of the overarching aesthetic resonated with a lot of people for generations to come. And I think
I know we'll talk about it more later, Steve. But one of the things too, I wanted to just quickly point out to anybody listening to this or watching. I mean, from that first record, from the jump, he's already creating a mythology.
yes.
He's already like, and you had kind of alluded to this sort of early on in our conversation just a little bit ago. In the end, he really did care about his career and to some extent how he was viewed, especially at the tail end. It felt like he really dug his heels into getting sort of the camaraderie, so to speak, with Jim O'Rourke or Thurston Moore. Like I think he really sort of felt at home with those particular artists. But I think what was really attractive to them, especially reading interviews with them, was he created mythology from the jump. Like
Oh
just,
yeah.
and it was so purposeful. And it's almost like if you could expand on that more, like what why did he do that for the people that don't really know? I mean, we kind of know, but if you could explain why did he do that?
So, a lot of the country blues people that he was listening to, and the cultures that they came from, they had just radically different stories, and radically different vernacular, radically different language in terms of how they communicated and whatnot. And, a lot of these guys were legends because their stories weren't documented in, to the degree that stories are documented now. In the early part of the 20th century, a lot of stuff is lost to history. You could say that, I mean, I think it would be safe to say that Robert Johnson is the most famous of the country blues artists, and he has such an impact. And we know almost nothing about his life. There's one photo of him that I think that exists in the world. So, I mean, really, like, if you're a kid, and when you're a kid and you get really into records, you want to know everything about them. You want to know, you pour over all the details, you stare at the album cover, you read every word printed on the jackets of the inserts to gain any kind of insight or like knowledge into what it is, that you're so excited about. So, with the country blues, John had so little to work with. I mean, there's very little documentation about any of these people or their lives and whatnot. So, he created, with his first record, one side of the record says John Fahey, the other side of the record says Blind Joe Death. And Blind Joe Death was like this fictional pseudonym that he created, like, let me make my own fake blues guy. Like Blind Lemon Jefferson or Big Bill Bruesney, or these people have names and legacies and sort of legends behind them. So he, like, as a prank, created this fictional guy named Blind Joe Death and sort of like imagined what it would be like to be a country blues player, because he was so obsessed with that music.
Not
Uh,
to mention the Blind Thomas guys that he had earlier too with the phonotone. He was
so
trying to reincarnate or become that in a sense or present that.
I don't know. Again, I don't think he was doing it for him at that point. I mean, I don't think he thought for a second that anyone would ever see any of this phonotone stuff
True,
or
yeah.
have it examined to like an intellectual academic level.
Yeah.
This was just like a fun thing for a suburban kid with a weird sense of humor.
Yeah. They were up late just drinking, being, just making recordings.
Oh, and like, you know what I mean? Getting like too excited about their interests.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like making up all these like crazy stories and, ideas and legends and whatnot, And I mean, these are people that had a lot more free time on their hands. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't much television. There was no internet. Radio was fairly limited at that point as well. So there wasn't really a youth culture that they were a part of. So they were really sort of like inventing all this stuff for their own amusement. And again, I don't think prior to like I'd say almost maybe even like 1965. I'm just using as a benchmark, but I don't think anything before 1965 he did with any intentionality in regards to it being examined or disseminated by like a wider audience. I think
But
it
we
was
should and we should talk about some of the some of the records that come and some by the mid '60s, Tacoma is becoming like a real label, and he's getting more and more advanced recording. He's trying a lot more experimenting, and slowly sort of like really creating not just a style and a persona, but really creating like a recording career essentially. And he ends up on Vanguard. So
yeah.
that was through his Ed Denson, I believe, right? Or was it just through? How
It
did he
was
end up there?
it was actually through yeah he basically he moved out to California in the 60s to become part of the UCLA's folklore program, which was a new program at the time. It was a graduate program studying folk music and whatnot. And this was a dream come true in a way because it's like, oh wow, this is an academic course of study in exactly what I'm interested in. It's never been done before. This was like a totally new territory. So he moved out to California for that program and for academia rather than for stardom or
Yeah.
performing. So the head of the program is a guy, I think his name was D.K. Wilgus, I think was his name. And Sam Charters he was an A&R guy for Vanguard at the time, but he was an academic of the blues. He wrote many books about the blues. He documented the blues. He worked with a lot of the Chicago, 50s blues guys, more the electric blues guys. So Sam Charters was one of the foremost authorities of blues and folk music at that time. So he was a guest at one of, like he was a guest lecturer in the program, and him and John met there. And I think they had a pretty contentious first meeting in which they didn't agree about something. And John was very vocal and very opinionated, and I think they got into some sort of argument at the time. But
And John was rather contentious, it seems like, with almost everyone he met. It's he walked around with a chip on his shoulder, is what I
yeah,
gathered.
he, he was a complex guy, but he respected Sam Charters, and he respected Sam's work, and he and his writing and whatnot. And he sent Sam a copy of the first 100 copy pressed, Blind Joe Death the records.
Hmm.
And at the time, he didn't, Sam didn't really think very much of it. He thought it was pretty amateurish and not that exciting. Um, and it wasn't until a couple records deep into Fahey's catalog that he started seeing John improve sort of exponentially as a musician, which fair enough. It's true. You listen to the first recordings of the first record, and they are very hesitant in regards to musicianship. And which is, as you so rightfully pointed out, was a big part in John's re-recording of his records, which is also crazy. I mean, I can't really think of much precedent of people going back and re-recording entire albums and then re-releasing them.
I mean, it's
Once they've
almost as
It
if that
causes the nightmare now.
it's almost as if the original like versions of that record is almost like the demo. So,
very much so. And there is that record of the first two albums on Tacoma, the early sessions, which documents the first two versions of the first two records, which were later sort of
Yes, and
banished.
those are very rare in themselves. Yes.
Those are very rare themselves because John wasn't particularly proud of them. So I think he
Yeah.
always kind of kept those in the distance and would prefer people listen to the 67 recordings of those, as they are much, more assured playing and whatnot. And the compositions really do come alive in those 67 recordings in a way that they don't in the 1959 versions. But that being said, the 59 versions in their embryonic state are really are kind of a wonder to behold. And again, sort of with the phonotone stuff in a similar sense, where it's like you kind of see these, this artist sort of become who he's going to be in these blueprints and whatnot. And again, I don't necessarily think the John Fahey early sessions or the phonotone recordings are essential listening for non you know,
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, I think they're more interesting to fans of John Fahey than they are sort of standalone records. And I would definitely recommend the 67 versions to someone just starting out and whatnot. But if you're a diehard Fahey fan and you really want to track his trajectory, those early recordings are really very interesting in their embryonic states.
So
But going back to Vanguard, what's interesting, and I'd love to hear your take on this, Steve. What did that mean to Fahey when he ended up on Vanguard? What did that mean to him?
Well, for him, it was credentials. He was co-signed. Vanguard was a major label, and they did a ton of classical records. And you have to understand, John was very much as much a classical records guy as he was a bluegrass or blues fan as well. He loved classical music. He was obsessed with a lot of that music, and so for him, Vanguard was serious stuff. And I think the Vanguard stamp of approval was extraordinarily validating for him, especially for someone who sort of toiled in his own self-released obscurity. He really wanted the Vanguard situation to work out. He really wanted it to take his career to the next level. But again, just like in the early '60s when out in the Berkeley scene, like he didn't want to play the game. He did not, he didn't want to listen to what Sam had to say about the records. He didn't participate in the process, and he pretty much rejected everything like right out the gate. The first record he did on Vanguard is Requia, which is a fascinating record. The A side is very much sort of Fahey solo finger picking guitar, and the B side is a sound collage. It's a sidelong sound collage that incorporates field recordings, found sounds, historical speeches, all kinds of stuff in this like crazy melange of '60s radicalism. And
And I like your story in the book about he really toiled over the recording of that, right? And he was almost I think he was unhappy actually with how it came out in the end.
basically what happened was he put together, he did his guitar parts and then he like assembled all these random sounds, these found sounds and field recordings and whatnot that he wanted to incorporate into the music, but he didn't know how to do that. He didn't have the technical skill to create a sound collage record. He did a little bit of tape splicing on his like self-released Tacoma records, just because he didn't necessarily like just to get the best take. Like if he screwed up halfway through, he just splice over and and they're really cool because you could kind of hear where the splices happen. But in terms of like creating a new work, you know, through those materials, like he just didn't have the capability. He wasn't a sound editor. He wasn't an expert in that. And he sent Sam Charters notes on how he wanted things to be and where he wanted this sound and that and whatnot. And Sam Charters did a first pass of it for him. He's like, I'm going to put this together for you. I'm going to make this happen for you. And then sent him the recordings for notes. He's like, here's what I put together. Let me know what you think. What do you want done? How do you want to do it? And John never responded. And he just like went ghost. And so the record came out, the way Sam put it together. And, Fahey hated the record. He said he did. He said it was terrible and wanted nothing to do with it.
And there was actual photo, like actual mock magazine ads for this. Like they actually
Oh,
tried
yeah.
to promote this and everything.
That's what I mean. Like Vanguard is a real label. Sam Charters was a real producer. I mean, these were guys that were making, huge cultural strides at the time. Again, Country Joe and the Fish, Sam Charters was involved with those productions as well. So basically Fahey's whole team was like platinum guys. Guys that are they're making serious money, really big cultural effect, huge impact. So he felt, he's like, oh well, if these dumb hippie guys who don't even know what they're doing, are getting all this acclaim, this is really my time. But he couldn't embrace the process. He couldn't embrace the other people involved in the project. He couldn't embrace, performing live. It was a huge, arduous task for him performing. He had terrible stage fright, which he would combat with, heroic, intake of
Yeah.
alcohol, which we just get blackout drunk on stage. He would, get into rambling arguments with the audience. He would insult people. I mean, he would just do everything wrong. If you want to be a successful folk musician in California in the 60s, John Fahey is sort of like the textbook what not to do in a lot of ways.
And he still somehow amassed a great career. It's funny. He was like fighting against that sort of progression in his own way. Just,
Yes and no, and that's sort of one of the things that's sort of so fascinating about John is like in some ways he really, really craved the validation and success, and in other ways he would do everything he could to sabotage that.
mm,
So
I mean, even the advertisement. There's a I was on eBay a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually just looking up John Fahey flyers because I've
that's the
always wanted
Tombstone one.
what's that?
Is that the Tombstone one?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I was like eyeing that up. I think it's a reprint because it's too cheap to be an original. I
Yeah.
feel like it, but the ad is like it's on a tombstone. It's like now I don't know if that was just an aesthetic choice that like oh kind of makes sense with Fahey's sort of obsession with death almost in a certain way,
very
but
much so.
it also even felt like it was kind of like from what you're saying and kind of contextually looking back at it, it's like well, if Fahey didn't even like this record, he'd want to bury it. You know what I
And
mean?
look at the cover of Requiem. This is
Hmm.
1967 in the height of the
Yeah.
hippie era. Here's this
Yeah.
guy wearing a suit,
Yeah, right. Right.
short
This blew me
hair,
away too, because
clean
this
cut
is one of
guy.
his, the second side is one of his most experimental, most out there things he ever did, and this is the cover you get. I mean, Yellow Princess, it seems like that'd be more of what you get, but no,
Yes.
this is the bonkers one.
That's the bonkers one. And again, it's just sort of like, the last thing you would want to sell records in 1967 in the hippie folk California marketplace is a guy with a short hair and a suit. You know what I mean? Like
Well, there are flowers though, you know. You know.
I mean, again, like, basically, like, him and the Velvet Underground were the only people singing about, talking about death in their work during this time period. This is the summer of love. you know
Right.
um,
Yeah.
so he was really like the antithesis of everything that was going on at the time. So while yes, maybe he did want success and maybe he did want acclaim and maybe he did want to be recognized for achievements, he wasn't willing to put on some tie-dye, grow his hair, and start dropping acid. Like that was not at
Yeah.
all, he wasn't interested in any of that, and if anything he was more of a reactionary, and he would you know give Bible sermons at his at his concerts, and wear a suit and tie in his album cover, and just really, and he didn't wear a suit and tie in his day to day. This was very much for the
Yeah.
kid. I mean, he was, again, he was just he was a contrarian even to himself. And I think that was always one of the biggest struggles for the people who championed him, whether it is Sam Charters or Jim O'Rourke or whomever. They loved John. They thought he was a genius. They wanted him to have success. They wanted him to be comfortable, and he would do everything he could to sabotage all of them, all along the way. A lot of people would just wash their hands of him because they just couldn't deal with him. And that's not just in the music industry. That was definitely similar with his love life, and his wives and girlfriends and stuff. They would love him and want to help him and want to take care of him and want him to be healthy, and he would just push them away.
Yeah.
But it's interesting on the same token we're talking about him being sort of anti-hippie. But it's one of the things I wanted to just bring up briefly, and I wanted your take on it, Steven, is the Red Crayola collaboration. That was kind of this failed collaboration. And Red Crayola, they're not a psych band in my mind, but they teeter on that sort of line. How did that come about and what happened?
Well, I don't think John put too much thought into it. I think he was asked to do it, and he just came in and did it, and left, and never really thought too much more about it. He had similar instances with Country Joe and the Fish at the same time, where they covered one of his songs, and I think he played on one of their records. But again, he didn't put much stock into what anyone else was really doing. There was just sort of like happenstance, you
So
know.
it was like a singular focus for him, really, almost. Yeah.
Very much so. And he was, he wasn't a very collaborative guy. He didn't really get along that well with other people. He had his own goals. He had his own way of doing things. He was definitely socially awkward, and just sort of, I mean, one of his, his wife Jan said, he always really wanted to be a preacher, but he was too negative, and all he would do was preach fire and brimstone and given the opportunity. And he wasn't really that interested in helping people, so he wouldn't necessarily be a very good, preacher. But he loved the fire and brimstone, and he loved the, the scare tactics of religion and whatnot. But he
The,
wasn't really that interested in people. In regards to John's work in the 60s, there was a lot of opportunity for John. And, he was very much looked at as sort of like a godfather of the folk, guitar movement that was happening, because a lot of these guys who were in the rock bands who were referencing, the country blues and whatnot, they weren't experts. They were amateurs. They were just starting to get into this stuff. Whereas John at this point had been like deeply involved with 78 collecting for almost a decade. So he knew more than almost anybody at the time, especially out there. And so he was really looked upon as being like a man of accomplishment, a man of great depth and thought, and as sort of unapproachable in a lot of ways, because like I said, he, especially during his live performances, he would get really inebriated and he would get very surly and he would turn off a lot of his audience in that way. And a lot of his friends and a lot of the people who would be allies to him, he would just turn off with his, with his attitudes and with his behavior.
And it ends
Uh,
up sort of going back to where he started, ending up back on Tacoma, sort of at the end of the
yeah,
60s.
yeah. I mean, he never really left Tacoma in a way because he had
Right.
his own
It's his
ideas.
label.
And he just, well, we said he was so prolific during that time. I mean, he
Yeah.
was just cranking out records, and they were so good. There's just great record after great record after great record after great record. I mean, his run in the 60s was unparalleled in regards to not only how great it was in quality, but also how prolific he was at the time. I mean, again, that was par for the course in the 60s. The Beatles and the Beach Boys, they're cranking out great records every 6 months, classics. And John was one of the guys, in the 60s who was really doing that, as well on his own terms. And so he really created in the 60s, which would, a catalog that was timeless and that would really set the course not only for the rest of his career, but for the rest of solo guitar, as an ideology and as a genre moving forward.
Well, that's a great place to sort of cap it. So yeah, we'll resume more in part two. There's so much to talk about with John. So
yeah. Yeah.
for all you watching, yeah, you'll be seeing another video soon.
Great.
And we'll be back with Steve and Sean. Yeah, any final, Sean, you were going to say something to close it out,
Yeah,
or?
no, I think what's super interesting to kind of tie this up on my end too, and like and hearing Steve you talk about sort of and just kind of hearing you speak about where Fahey started and like where it ends in the 60s. In the 60s, starts his own private press record label and kind of ends the 60s almost on a major label that, and I think it's no secret that he really wanted to be on Vanguard, if I'm not mistaken. That was kind of
Oh
what
yeah.
he really, really wanted to be. And the fact that it didn't work out is kind of interesting in the sense that where we sort of end up in the 70s, it just contextually makes it even more interesting. So to see this sort of trajectory is, and just to hear you speak about it and to really sort of think about it is, you're right, is pretty unparalleled in terms of his amount of work and the originality in all of those records.
Oh, very much
There's
so.
to me, there's not a stinker in any of those records.
Oh,
They're just
no, no, no. They're all great. There's definitely a couple more things to talk about in regards to his liner notes and whatnot in the 60s. And especially that, next time I'd like to talk just at least a little bit about the great San Bernardino birthday party and what a
Oh,
and
we absolutely should. Yes.
about
Yeah.
what bizarre concepts those records are, and just how even to this day there's never been another record like Voice of the Turtle. Like
Yeah,
who puts
this
their
may be
high
my
school
favorite record. Yeah.
girlfriend? Who puts pictures of their high school girlfriends in their records? Who puts a picture of their like librarian from
Well, we do know later, like at essentially the one of his very last records is he gets pretty obsessed with women,
Yeah.
and
I mean, even just like, but again, like just sort of like making your life, sort of like the everyday sort of, trials and tribulations of humanity into like a narrative on a record is just like I can't think of any precedent to it, and I can't think of anything or even an antecedent to it of another artist that makes himself more vulnerable and like shows his foibles and his humanity to such a degree. Like most artists, most musicians, like present themselves as being almost unflappable, being like sort of like supermen or women, or like they exude confidence because they have to, because it's part of the job. But John's liner notes just self-exposes all of his weaknesses and humanity and just like errors. And I don't necessarily, I still can't really understand why someone would make that choice, but it's a fascinating choice to make, and it really brings in the listener closer to him as an artist, um, than a lot of other artists, and I think that's why people have such a really, profound connection to Fahey, because they could really relate to him.